If you're a political junkie like I am, then you've probably already heard that a few days ago, Jeremy Corbyn launched a new political party in the UK. Now, you kind of need to know the history of Corbyn and the Labour Party over the last decade or so to understand where this comes from. But in brief, Corbyn was the Labour Party back in the mid to late 2010s. He was a very strong left-wing progressive voice, and he was kind of at war with the media and the more centrist, liberal, corporate elements of his party throughout his entire tenureship, constantly accused of things like anti-Semitism because of his views on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And they really forced him not only out of his leadership position, but eventually out of the party with all of this stuff. And Jeremy Corbyn was a very popular leader, very popular figure among the left-wing progressive base of the party, and not just in the UK, even leftists and progressives around the world saw in him a really strong voice for their movement and their cause. And a lot of people became disenfranchised with the Labour Party, them going back to their more centrist, neoliberal kind of not roots. The Labour Party roots are much more working class politics based, but kind of like the Tony Blair era Labour Party was kind of revived with Keir Starmer coming in as leader. And now Keir Starmer did lead the Labour Party to a big electoral victory in the last UK general election. However, that was mostly due to the extreme unpopularity of the Tories, the Conservative Party, who had been in power for about a decade. They had numerous leaders throughout that time: Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, who infamously, her tenureship couldn't even outlast a head of lettuce. And then I forget the most recent guy, was it Rishi Sunak, I believe, was the last prime minister from the Conservative Party before Keir Starmer and the Labour Party won big in the last general election. But like I said, Labour's big victory was mostly due to people's discontent with the Conservative Party as living conditions, the affordability crisis continued to degrade. Public services continued to degrade under the Tories for 10 years. And so even though Labour still wasn't very popular, they were the party that stood to benefit most from the unpopularity of the Conservatives. They ran a very neoliberal centrist campaign, and the way that they've governed has been just frankly like Tory light. There really has not been a drastic change in their style of governance versus the decade of Tory rule before them. And because of that, among other reasons, such as the Labour government and Keir Starmer's support for the Israel siege on Gaza and their occupation of the West Bank, and then just frankly a general lack of charisma, and that's just my own vantage point, but I wouldn't say Keir Starmer is the most charming or personable leader. His favorability is extremely low. So he has a 23% approval rating, favorable rating, and a 69% unfavorable rating. That's a huge gap. He's negative 46, and this was in May, so it may be a little better now, it may be a little worse, but it's going to be around the same. He's hugely unpopular, not just amongst the right, who of course is going to hate anyone who's associated with even, a moderately centrist or liberal approach to politics, but the left-wing base hates him as well. I don't even know who the hell these 23% are, but frankly, he's a very unpopular leader. Most people are just not happy with him and what the party has been doing. But especially the left-wing base, and especially the left-wing base that was very pro-Corbyn, that did want a more progressive left-wing voice at the front of the Labour Party, who wanted the Labour Party to kind of go back to its roots as a working-class, left-wing, populist kind of party. And so with Keir Starmer making Labour once again, like in the Tony Blair era, just kind of a conservative, light, neoliberal party, there really was no longer a left-wing voice in mainstream UK party politics, because the Liberal Democrats are also a very centrist neoliberal party. And then the new party that's been on the rise, Nigel Farage's Reform Party, is even further right than the Conservatives. They're like a far-right populist party, even though this is a different topic, but far-right populism is kind of a myth in my opinion. Far-right populism, to me, is just give everything to the corporations and the rich, take everything away from the working class, and they just code it in very working class language. You know, they say the reason they want to kick immigrants out is to benefit working people, but history shows us that time and time again, whenever these type of parties get in power, they just use their power to serve corporate interests. Yes, they do pick on immigrants and marginalized communities, but it's not to the benefit of the working class. The working class always suffers as well. They kind of vote for their own suffering under the guise of this rhetoric, this right-wing populist rhetoric, like the MAGA movement as well, that tells them, hey, we're gonna go after these immigrants, these trans people, all these people are your problems, not the billionaires. You know what I mean? They'll still pick at the elite, like they'll claim they're against the elite, but really it's more of a cultural liberal elite that they paint themselves as being against. They don't go after the wealthy corporate elite at all. And so to me, right-wing populism is just like a campaigning tactic as an ideology. It never is actually followed up on. They never actually fight for the working class. But anyways, that's my own opinion on that. But the point is that the Reform Party is this far-right, anti-immigrant, right-wing populist party. And so there was no longer any left-wing voice, true left-wing progressive voice in UK politics. And so Jeremy Corbyn, and I forget her name, I have to mention her as well, I believe it's Zarah Sultana. I'm not from the UK, so I'm not as familiar with, I'm familiar with the party leaders and the bigger names, and I haven't heard of Zarah until now. But her and Corbyn came out saying they're launching this new party that's going to be a true left-wing, true progressive, and truly populist voice in the UK. And clearly, it was a welcome sign because, as this article here says, Corbyn hints at your party as name for new political movement. I'm not sure if that's actually going to be the party name. From my vantage point, it seemed like that was kind of a placeholder name, and they're kind of getting people to register for the party, and there's going to be a convention where they determine the party platform. And to me, it seems like they're going to come up with the party name as more of a grassroots effort as well, but maybe it'll be called Your Party, who knows? Personally, even though I like that this is happening, I don't think Your Party is a great party name, so I'd rather they, pick a different name. But regardless of the name, clearly there's a lot of excitement because nearly 500,000 people, as this article, which came out at around noon today, says, have already registered for this party that they only announced 3 days ago. And then updated a few hours ago, Jeremy Corbyn on Twitter announced that officially 500,000 people in only 3 days have registered to be a member of this party. So clearly there's already a ton of grassroots support for this. Clearly there was a yearning amongst the progressive left-wing base. Anybody in the UK who leans more towards that ideology have felt like they haven't had true representation in UK party politics since Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party. And while yes, in many corners of the UK political world, Corbyn is very unpopular because of some of the ways he was smeared in the media, but also just, of course, the right-wing base is going to hate his truly staunchly left-wing ideology. But personally, I think this is fantastic news. Since they are newer, I don't know how much time they'll have to really put together a winning coalition for the next election, but even if they can get a lot of seats in parliament, because right now the Reform Party is on track to win a plurality of seats, not a majority, but enough that they would be the biggest party in parliament and perhaps set to form the next government. If you're someone like myself who views that as a really dangerous thing to happen, like I said, I believe right-wing populism is basically just a farce and is really just corporate fascism, frankly, whenever we see it implemented. Who knows, maybe they would be different, but knowing Nigel Farage and his history and who he's associated with, I really just think that once again, this is just a far-right neo-fascist or straight-up fascist movement that's looking to take over and do to the UK what Donald Trump and the MAGA movement are currently doing in the United States. So I think it's a really dangerous and scary potential that they could potentially form government and take power. And the Labour Party, as is under Kier Starmer, or even under numerous of the centrist neoliberal influences in that party, it's not going to cut it. You can't fight fascism. You can't fight far-right populism with neoliberalism. You can only fight fascism and far-right populism with true progressive left-wing populism, with a true progressive ideology. And Jeremy Corbyn has that history, even if he's not the leader of the party, just him being the founder of it, it having his endorsement, and he's going to be the one kind of helping to curate the platform. Of course, he also is going to make it a grassroots process, but the reason people are signing up is because they know Corbyn's history. They agree with him on most issues. They agree in, more funding for the NHS, fixing the NHS, stopping the privatization of the NHS, making water services public again, rail services public again, taking them out of the hands of private corporations. Of course, his stance on Israel-Gaza, especially in the face of what Keir Starmer has done on that issue, makes him a very prominent, popular leader. And so I think 500,000 registrations in 3 days is incredible. Hopefully the movement only grows from there. As someone who's more progressive and left-wing myself, I think this is great news. I think this is exactly what's needed at this moment in time in UK politics to fight the rise of the far right. And I just hope that they only continue to grow and get stronger from here. Of course, it'll get more difficult as well as the media attacks on them begin, as the attacks from perhaps the Labour Party and even more centrist-y parties and, the Tories. It's going to be a really interesting dynamic, the next UK general election, where you have a far-right party, a genuinely far-right party, a genuinely right-wing conservative party in the Tories, and then a centrist-y neoliberal party with Labour, and then, Lib Dems kind of being similar, and then now you also have a truly left-wing progressive party as well. So you really have all corners of the political spectrum covered. Really interesting. That's not always the case. Even in parliamentary systems, a lot of times you have just kind of right-wing, centrist, kind of left-wing, but really all like corporate parties in a lot of countries that have parliamentary systems. You don't always actually have a real choice of these different ideologies. But this time, from my vantage point, there's some massive and clear-cut differences between the vision that all of these parties are offering. To me, the Tories and Labour at this point are kind of just, very small differences from each other. But in terms of reform versus this new Corbyn party, that's where we see a truly striking contrast. And both of them as well, in different ways, are also very different from the status quo of what the Labour and Conservative parties have done over the last few decades. So it's a really interesting time in UK politics. And for me, this gives me some hope that perhaps we won't be doomed to another prominent Western nation falling to the rise of far-right populism and fascism.